to Damascus. I had the opportunity to accompany our group there and actually lead our group through this, and we're very, very glad to share some of our observations with you today. MEI has had a travel program in place now for several years. A couple times a year, we usually take our supporters, our donors, others who care about the region into different parts of the region to allow them to experience it firsthand. We really have three goals for our program here. One is we want to expose our supporters to the Middle East, want them to see it and experience for themselves. Secondly, we want to stay engaged on the relevant topics of the region that all of us are following on a regular basis here. And then third, we want to support ongoing initiatives at the Middle East Institute that are related to activities that are going on in the region. Today, our panel consists of this is Mary Boyes. Mary is a New York attorney, and she's also a member of the Board of Governors for the Middle East Institute. Was one of our travelers during this trip and has been on many of our trips here over the last couple of years. So she's going to offer some insights for us. We also have Charles Lister. Charles is a Syria scholar at the Middle East Institute. Many of you know him. He is really, I think, the most esteemed Syrian scholar across the think tank community here. He writes and speaks and appears on television quite prolifically on topics of this. He's been engaged in Syria for a long period of time, and especially over the last year with the change of government. We also have our CEO, Ambassador Stu Jones. Ambassador Jones is a former ambassador of the United States to Jordan and Iraq, and then he's also served in senior diplomatic positions within our government. And of course, as I mentioned, I'm Joe Votel. I'm a former CENTCOM commander, serving from 2016 to 2019 in that capacity. And we look forward to talking with you today. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of the trip so you understand what we did, who we met with, who we didn't have an opportunity to meet with. Let me just share a couple things here. We had 10 total travelers. We were in the region from the 1st to the 6th of November, so most of our information is only about a month old. We arrived in Amman. We had some overview meetings. The first evening we were in Amman with the U.S. Embassy country team, as well as with Brigadier General Mason Dula, who is the commander of the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force Central that has responsibility for our special operations activities in the region. Importantly, he has a very strong relationship with the Syrian Democratic Forces, and of course is front and center in our continuing efforts to keep pressure on the Islamic State terrorist group there. Following that, we traveled into Damascus. We spent 4 days with ministerial engagements in Damascus, interspersed with several cultural events. I never expected that I would ever travel to Damascus, much less on a Royal Jordanian aircraft. So it was quite a nice surprise for me, but we were welcomed and we had an opportunity to see a lot, to talk to a lot of people, and as I mentioned, to experience other aspects of life in Damascus. We did visit one of the local suburbs that had been heavily targeted by the regime during the fighting, and had an opportunity to see some of what took place out there as well. Our trip overlapped with President al-Shara's visit to the United States. He departed shortly after we arrived, so we unfortunately were not able to meet with him. We met with virtually everybody else. But interestingly, a lot of what we were able to do was help inform his ministers, his advisors on potential engagements that he was going to have in the United States in an indirect way, but I think in an impactful way. Just to give you a list of the people that we met with, so you have a good perspective of this. We did talk with the ambassadors from Jordan, Turkey, and the European Union. These are the ambassadors from those countries or entities to Syria. That was really important to getting an overview from kind of some of the external actors. We did meet with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Americas desk, a lot of focus there. We met with the advisor to the president, an important engagement, particularly as he was getting ready to meet with our president. Spent a lot of time in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the Minister of Foreign Affairs as well. We followed that and had an extensive session with a think tank that is sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was quite good, allowed us to cover a broad perspective of topics with them, with some folks that have really got some intellectual heft to them. We spent an evening with the governor of Soweto and learning about the challenges down in Soweto with the situation down there. Quite interesting. We met with him in Damascus, not down in the area, largely because of some of the violence is still taking place down there. We met with the electorate committee. We talked to the Minister of Information, the Minister of Communications and Information Technology, and we finished up with quite an interesting meeting with the Minister of Interior. And then we kind of rounded out our visit. Our objectives for this trip and meeting with all of those people were really threefold. There are three things we wanted to try to accomplish on this trip. First was to kind of assess the agenda of the new government. What are they doing? Where are they going? Where are they making progress? Where are their obstacles, roadblocks to them moving forward? Second of all, we wanted to examine the strategy of regional integration and cooperation. Obviously, there's a lot of influence still occurring in Syria, so we wanted to understand that and how that was impacting the situation positively or negatively. And then third, we wanted to gauge the prospects for economic recovery, growth, reconstruction, and return of refugees. And I think we were able to really touch on all three of those big objectives, as we'll talk about in just a moment. Our plan today, at least the first portion of this, is to allow some of our panel just to talk a little bit. I'm gonna in a moment I'll turn it over to Charles, and Charles is gonna talk to us a little bit about the security challenges in the country and what we heard, what we saw, and kind of bring us up to speed on where that is, and he'll give us some reflections also from the recent visit of President al-Shara to meet with our president. Then we'll go to Mary, and Mary's going to talk relatively briefly about the financial situation and where we are. Some of us will join in and add some comments to that. We want to talk a little bit about the financial investment situation in the country. That was an important area for us. I'll then talk a little bit about Syrian Democratic Force integration. We did not meet with any Syrian Democratic Force representatives there, but certainly this was a topic with a number of the ministers and others we met with. So I'll try to round that out a little bit and give you a perspective on where we think this sits right now in terms of moving forward. And then finally, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Jones, and Ambassador Jones will finish up by talking about some of the recommendations in our recently released report on this, which will be available to all of you. I want to remind you, you will have the opportunity to ask questions, and we encourage you to do that. We are on the record here today, as we have a public audience. What you should do is, if you have a question anytime, you should go ahead and type it into the question and answer icon there, and enter your questions in there, and we will select them out of there, and when we get to the question and answer period, we'll get to those questions. So again, thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Charles to kind of get us started with a little bit of a discussion on the security situation, and kind of where we are, what we heard, where we think we're going today. Charles?
Great. Thank you so much, General. And thank you for all of that introduction, which was, I think, very helpful. I'll try to be brief. I mean, the first thing to say is when the Bashar al-Assad's regime fell just over 12 months ago, I suspect, certainly I, but many, many others would have expected Syria to be a lot more unstable today than it is. Given the extraordinary complexity of the conflict space, the sheer number and breadth of armed groups, not just from the opposition, but from many other parties, the complex geopolitics that has surrounded Syria's conflict for a long time. And so I think all things considered at the kind of 60,000-foot level on a security level, Syria is in a better place today than I think anybody would have expected. But with that being said, it still has a plethora of very significant security challenges. And some of them have been dealt with effectively and some of them not so much. And so I'll try to just provide a kind of very brief look at the core security challenges that continue to be faced. One of them, which raised its head very early on, was the emergence of what looked like an anti-government insurgency, mostly on the coast of Syria. This insurgency's steady development from January through to March this year, unquestionably with some external assistance from Iran and/or Hezbollah, was basically the trigger that led to the very significant violence that struck Syria in March. And I think in the months since, that insurgency is a shadow of its former self. The Syrian transitional government, mostly through the Ministry of Interior, has dealt quite effectively with targeting insurgent cells on the coast, but also in areas like Homs and Hama. And certainly the operational tempo of that insurgency has almost disappeared today. So an initial challenge that could have become really very, very significant, certainly when we look at similar challenges like in Iraq and previously, that has been not fully defeated, but certainly contained and dealt with quite effectively. The big one that the international community has always paid so much attention to, of course, is ISIS. Very long story short, frankly speaking, the United States and the global coalition are split, operating on two different theaters in Syria now. Of course, we have our longtime partners, the Syrian Democratic Forces, with whom we've been coordinating very closely for over a decade. And now we have, as we've just heard from the current commander of CENTCOM, Admiral Cooper, who spoke to our conference here at MEI just a little earlier today, a rapidly developing relationship with the new Syrian transitional government in terms of countering ISIS, and for what it's worth, also the remnants of Iran's networks in Syria. Both of those campaigns, both of those partner relationships continue to be very effective. But I think the conclusion very much is if we want to render a durable and significant defeat to ISIS in Syria, we need to be doing that through one partner. And that's where this challenge of convincing the SDF to integrate into the state is a very big outstanding issue, of course, that General Votel will address shortly. ISIS, on an operational level, is basically running two tracks of military campaign or terrorist campaign. One is an insurgency in the SDF-held area of northeastern Syria. Over 90% of ISIS attacks in 2025 have been in SDF-held areas. And that insurgency remains low level. It's not super sophisticated, but it is persistent. The 10% of ISIS attacks that I worry about a lot more are in government-held areas, where typically each attack is far more deadly, far more potent and targeted. And what we have also seen in the past maybe 8 or 9 months is 15 mass casualty terrorist attack plots by ISIS foiled by Syria's Ministry of Interior and their new General Intelligence Service, many of which, as I understand, came as a result of intelligence sharing between the United States and the Syrian government. But those attacks have sought to target Shia shrines, Alawite shrines, Christian churches, and on one occasion, a busload of returning refugees. So clearly seeking to undermine the transitional government's ability to protect its people with a specific eye to attacking minorities. And that's very, very dangerous. Only one of those attacks has broken through, and we had that attack in a church just outside Damascus a few months ago, with many killed. Vigilante violence is another significant challenge. People seeking to exact revenge for grievances and crimes from not just the past 14 years of war, but dating back decades. That was a really significant contributor to deadly violence across Syria over the past 12 months. But another promising metric is that it has significantly reduced in scale and in geographic scope in recent months. And so this current reduction of various levels of violence is going to be a running theme of many things that I have spoken about or will speak about. A few more things to note. The challenge with Israel remains persistent and I think increasingly significant. The United States had mediated direct talks between Syria and Israel earlier this year. Those talks broke down on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly at the end of September, and there has been no more direct talks since. In that time in which there have been no talks, Israeli ground incursions have rapidly intensified in number. In fact, in November, we had 101 ground incursions in the month, 101 incursions in 30 days. That was more than double the tempo of ground incursions seen in all the other months previously. This is placing great pressure on the government in Damascus and forcing it into a very tight corner with regards to popular demand that the government do something to put a stop to this. But of course, if it did, it would be creating the ingredients for all of the bad escalations that we can imagine. So this is a very persistent and very significant challenge for the transition. And interestingly, sat here in Washington, it's something that is challenging the Trump administration. The Trump administration has staked a direct claim on Syria's transition succeeding and stabilizing. And the biggest threat to that right now is Israel. And that poses a very troubling, I think, diplomatic dilemma for the Trump administration as to how to deal with that. Finally, I'll end on Sweden, which is, basically a persistent standoff between the government and a coalition of Druze militias in this southern governorate of the country. Horrible violence struck there in July. There have been tit-for-tat clashes along the disputed line of control in the months since, but very few casualties. The only thing I would highlight here in terms of framing it as a standoff is that there needs to be dialogue. And we heard this certainly from the governor, but also many other actors in Damascus. There needs to be dialogue to rebuild confidence between the two sides. The current de facto authorities in Sweden have taken a zero-sum approach to zero dialogue, zero communication, which is a continuing challenge. The Jordanian government a couple of weeks ago had managed for the first time to secure an agreement from several Druze figures inside Sweden, as well as Bedouin and tribal representatives in the immediate region, to have a meeting in Jordan to begin this process of dialogue. That meeting and its details was then leaked to Arabic-speaking media, clearly by the de facto authorities in Sweden, with an intention of having the meeting cancelled, which it then was. And then, quite worryingly, all 10 likely participants of that dialogue were then arrested about a week later inside Sweden, and 2 of their dead bodies turned up and dumped outside the National Hospital in Sweden, very much, I think, as a message that if you want to negotiate and if you want to speak with Damascus, this will be your fate. So very troubling indications inside Sweden right now, which have then given way to intra-Druze tensions, which we're seeing play out in recent days. So that is something that we heard very clearly from the governor of Sweden. That was his prediction. We're trying to engage, we're trying to communicate, but if this sustains itself, there will be problems inside Sweden as a result of this approach. So unfortunate, of course, that we're seeing that play out. But at some point down the line, it may actually open an avenue for some dialogue. Lastly, only because, General, you asked me to mention it, President Shara did have, I think, a successful visit to Washington. Everything I've heard about his meeting in the Oval Office was that it went very well. They flagged a number of issues to President Trump, one of them being what was at the time a standstill over the repeal of the Caesar Act, regarding one particular Republican congressman. To that, the President Trump, I'm told, responded first by saying he wasn't aware of that being a problem, and then second, that he would sort it out. And it was then sorted out with a phone call, as I understand. And I think we'll have some good news on that note very soon. And of course, we also saw Syria join the counter-ISIS coalition. quietly, by the way, with very little fanfare, mostly due to internal sensitivities inside Syria. By the way, as much to do with the Syrian population as to do with men at arms. But that is a very significant move on behalf of the Syrian government. Becoming the 90th member of the coalition was not an insignificant development. And I think very much goes to show just how much the US-Syrian relationship on the security level has been built up in recent months.
Thank you, Charles. Really appreciate that comprehensive discussion. Now, one of the things we did hear about was the potential for maybe the movement of the U.S. Coordination Center or some kind of node into Damascus. Has there been anything more about that you've heard? I don't know if Admiral Cooper maybe mentioned something today on that.
So he hasn't. I mean, officially on the record, we've had denials from Syria and from the US. But I think it is safe to say that there are explorations underway to establish, as you say, some kind of a node, a compound. It's not necessarily going to be a military base, which some media reporting has suggested. I don't think we're there yet. But yes, with the assistance of Syrian government authorities, there are searches underway to find the right kind of compound with access to an airfield or an airbase, in which I guess US Special Forces and I assume at times the intelligence community can be based as a node of on-the-ground contact and coordination with the Syrian government. And I think it's just worth emphasizing that this relationship, the US-Syrian relationship, is channeled through the Ministry of Interior, not through the Ministry of Defense. Ministry of Defense has a lot more controversy surrounding it, certainly a lot more complexity. The MOD is where all of the armed groups from Syria's conflict were placed. The MOI is far more locally recruited, far more specialist, and has received a lot of external assistance and training in recent months. So everything that we are doing, the US, is going through the MOI and the Interior Minister, who, of course, we spent a good amount of time meeting while we were there.
Thank you, Charles. Really appreciate it. So I think one of the second big things we obviously, as Charles kind of highlighted, one of the things there was a lot of discussion on kind of the security situation around the country. And while Damascus itself, the area in which we are operating, seems pretty stable, as you can tell, there still is an awful lot going on in Syria right now with some of the things that we kind of highlighted. Another big area that we talked about, of course, a big message that came to us from the Syrian government was the lifting of sanctions and opening the way for Western and other investment into the country. I think we all would agree that the ministers were pretty much on message about this. And so, Mary, maybe I'll turn it over to you, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what we heard and kind of what are the things that we ought to be thinking about with respect to kind of getting Syria back on their feet financially.
Thank you, General. And yes, General, as you say, U.S. sanctions under the so-called Caesar Act were the first and most important and most emphasized topic of every single meeting that we had. And virtually everyone started with the same script, that the U.S. sanctions must be lifted for Syria to reconstruct its economy, serve its people, and join the community of nations. The Caesar Act was passed in 2019 and signed by then President Trump. It intensified Obama-era sanctions on the government, and most importantly, it authorized secondary sanctions, not only on the Syrian regime and many individuals, but also on foreign companies, banks, individuals, and governments that supported the Syrian government or supported the Syrian military intelligence services or entities operating in Syria. Together, these sanctions caused a very sharp economic decline in Syria, including in all the key sectors like energy reconstruction and infrastructure. And when you add that to the destruction that Assad did on his own people, this is a country that is very much struggling economically. So the Syrian officials we met with were not exaggerating. Lifting the sanctions really is a key first step to their economic revival. Now, in June, President Trump signed an executive order ending for certain categories and for limited times some of the sanctions, but the president even this one does not have the overall power to eliminate all sanctions for an indefinite period. There's been a lot of opposition, especially in the House of Representatives, to repealing the sanctions without at least very severe conditions such as progress in human rights and end to sectarian fighting, etc. Some wanted there to be a snapback on sanctions if conditions were not met. And of course, no bank or foreign investor is going to go into a country and make a major investment if sanctions are going to be possibly snapped back. Today, the U.S. House of Representatives is expected to vote this afternoon on the NDAA, which includes repeal of the Caesar Act. There are some conditions, but not severe. Those are, I believe, still being worked out. There was a move yesterday to derail things, but it looks like these sanctions under Caesar will be repealed. And this is very significant to Syria's ability to get foreign investment and to do business globally. Now, as we see in Saudi Arabia, for example, just because a country wants investment doesn't mean they're going to get it. We've seen a lot of Saudi projects derailed by the lack of foreign investment that they had expected. But there are a few things going in Syria's favor. One is they're not looking for international aid. They want to rebuild their own country with investment funds. And two, one of our observations from the trip is that President al-Shara has attracted very accomplished professionals from the diaspora. Ministers include people from the IMF, from Ernst & Young. When we met with the Minister of Technology, for example, he was very successful in the private sector. He has a very detailed plan for a scheme routing internet fiber through Syria to avoid the Red Sea and cut transmission time. This is a huge tech opportunity. There is also a great deal of professional depth beyond the ministerial level. For example, I would make a point to talk to young people who are either at the end of the table or against the wall and ask them, well, where have you been for the last few years and what have you been doing? And I was expecting some pretty sad stories. Instead, I heard consistently, I was getting my PhD at Stanford. I was studying at Caltech. I was working in Germany. I was working in Switzerland. Well, how did you come back? And many of them said, well, the president called me. And the reason that happened is because a lot of these, for example, tech people in the diaspora under the Assad butchery were connected by WhatsApp and other chat groups. And so the president was able to tap into those and actually get the word out there that he wanted people back. There is also international interest. Special Envoy Tom Barrack has been engaging the private sector. We've not been reading about that, but he's been engaging energy, electricity, construction firms. Some other countries, such as Saudi Arabia, are already putting in investments, but the scale of investment that needs to happen is absolutely staggering. We did leave Damascus, drove out a mere 12 minutes to one of the suburbs, Daria, and the extent of the destruction was really just overwhelming. They were barrel bombed. They were under siege for many years. At one point, the Syrian government just forced all the people to leave. Many went north to Idlib, but the area is just totally devastated, but people have come back. Just rebuilding that one town is an enormous undertaking. Now, this is a very important step, but there are serious challenges. Syria needs a good insurance law. They need a commercial law other than Sharia law. They need judicial institutions that will enforce contracts. You can pass a law for an independent judiciary, but that doesn't mean you're going to have one in a short period of time. So this is an enormous step. It's the beginning of a new chapter, but it really is only the beginning. Thank you, General.
Thanks, Mary. That was great. And I'm so glad you highlighted this point that there is no expectation of a big donors conference where people are just going to pile money on. They definitely are focused on this idea of creating investment opportunities and investment environment. Ambassador or Charles, anything to add on this general topic from your perspective? Oh, good. Okay.
Oh, I think Mary did an excellent job.
Great, I agree. Okay, good. So let's crack on here. I want to just take a moment to just talk a little bit about integration between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the government of Syria, and Charles is touched on this a little bit here, and so I'll just kind of bring you up to speed on where we think we are right now. I think as everybody recalls, back in March we had an agreement in principle for an operational framework to integrate the Syrian Democratic Forces and the autonomous administration of North and East Syria into state institutions. That was a U.S.-led process. To date, there has not been much movement forward beyond that. We did not hear in any of our meetings that there was any particular progress on that. The deadline for kind of the full integration was by the end of the year. It's very apparent that implementation is now stalled and will likely go into 2026. Some of the external actors, of course, have some interest in this. Turkey, for example, wants to see this resolved quickly. So there may be some grace that passed by them, but again, the clock is ticking. There has been some ongoing tension between government forces and the SDF, local flare-ups in Aleppo, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor governorate that we've seen over the period. And the autonomous administration has accused Damascus of kind of lacking the seriousness, really putting the onus on the government for the slow pace, the no formal detailed agreements. The overall agreement was a very, very broad one that lacked a lot of detail. So there's a lot of work that has to move forward. We heard a lot about impediments during our various discussions on this. There are a number of them. There are different views on the political autonomy of the autonomous administration in the SDF versus more of a centralized control. Obviously, the autonomous region or the autonomous administration and the SDF want to be able to consolidate, protect their gains versus surrendering that to state authority. So that's a big impediment. There are disagreements over military integration modalities, whether the SDF will remain as cohesive formations with command structure in place and with an identity that is not significantly different than what it is today, versus more of a centralized approach where the central government has the authority to select and appoint governors, designate troop deployment locations, and influence things like financing and armament equipping of the forces. There are ideological differences as well, particularly within the military. For those who have spent some time with the SDF, you understand the secular, gender inclusive approach that is very characteristic of this. That clashes with the central government's more conservative Islamist approach to the military. There are, as I mentioned, other external actors here, external influence. I should say Turkey certainly is. They are back the new government. They maintain their views on the SDF as an extension of the PKK, and from our perspective, are pushing for the full integration of them into the centralized government. The U.S., of course, is another big influencer here. We obviously support the SDF as one of our principal anti-ISIS partners, but our policy has been a little bit indecisive to date on on how we actually do the integration, how we try to balance the various aspirations that I've kind of tried to outline for you here that exist and are still very much present today, and that we heard from a number of the ministries. Finally, there is some concern over this resources associated with this, how those would be controlled, how those would be shared between the SDF and between the broader Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior forces, as well as resources around oil, gas, wheat fields, all remain very, very contentious issues. For those of you that have ever been up in the north and eastern part of the country, you know that it does have some the remnants of gas and oil infrastructure, and it has some fairly fertile agricultural areas that could be a significant breadbasket. So control of those are quite significant. So I'll stop there, just kind of scope out what that looks like. Charles or Ambassador or Mary, anything to add on to that?
I might just just to complement. I think everything General you said is absolutely spot on. I would just add a couple extra points on the issue of and in part because I noticed it also came up in a few of the questions. This issue of decentralization, centralization, federalism. I mean, as someone who's worked on Syria for a long time, the federalism proposal is a non-starter. I think that would basically trigger civil war in Syria. The one thing that you could get all Syrians on all sides of the conflict over 14 years to agree on was basically the opposite of federalism. On the other hand, though, the issue of decentralization is basically already a reality in Syria. Yes, Ahmed al-Shara as the president and the people around him keep talking about the need for a strong central government. But one of the things that he has recently started floating in the public is he said it on a few occasions. He said, we have this thing, it's called Law 107. Now, by the way, Law 107 was actually introduced by Bashar al-Assad in 2012. In the time of war, it was intended to give individual provinces the ability to take control over their own affairs. And so President al-Shara is saying, we may not be in war anymore, but we are still in a time of crisis. And in that sense, every single province needs to take control of their own affairs. And that is exactly where we are. Governors today in Syria are overwhelmingly in control of almost everything happening inside their provinces on the economics level, on the military level, on security, politics, and everything else. So in many ways, this whole debate about centralization and decentralization is an academic one, because the reality is we are already in a decentralized governing system in Syria. I also just wanted to highlight that Turkey, as I understand it, gave the US 12 months after the framework agreement to get this integration sorted. And so basically, in long story short, we may have until March to get this thing done. So I think we are likely to expect a very heavy push from the new year to try and force these talks forward. The difficulty is, as you said, General, that the confidence on both sides is very low. And if anything, it's getting worse with time. The SDF's decision a couple of days ago to ban any celebration marking the fall of Assad's regime triggered very significant frustration in the rest of Syria, and I think has really undercut confidence in that relationship. So it's going to take, I think, a heavy American push to try and get these two sides not just back to the table, but actually to implementing the framework agreement from March.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Charles. The last one there, that obviously there's been some desire, as we saw in March, for these elements to come together, but without some structure, without the support of an external actor like the United States, particularly in this issue, it is likely not to move forward. Anybody else on this particular issue? Okay, then I'd like to just pass it to Ambassador Jones, and Ambassador, if you could just kind of broadly scope the big recommendations that came out of our report.
Thank you, Joe. Well, listen, one of the great perks of being the president of the Middle East Institute is the opportunity to travel with Joe Botel and Mary Boyce and Charles Lister to places like Syria. And we had a wonderful delegation with tremendous expertise. You've heard some of it today, but we had experts in energy from the private sector. We had experts in law, obviously with Mary and others, and we had experts in tech, of course, security, diplomacy, the region. And it made for, I think, a really diverse and inclusive set of conversations with the ministers that we had. So I'm tasked with sort of laying out some of our recommendations, which are included, of course, in the report. And it's picking up on themes that you've already heard earlier from Joe and Charles and from Mary. First of all, this will be no surprise to people who know me. We need a diplomatic presence in Damascus. As Joe laid out, we met with the ambassadors of Turkey, of Jordan, of the EU. The Saudis are in Damascus. They've taken over the first floor of the Four Seasons. The Qataris are in Damascus. There's a lot of diplomatic activity going on inside of Damascus, and the United States needs to be present if we're going to shape this process and have influence. You know, I think we all agree that Ambassador Tom Barak has done an amazing job of setting the policy, of establishing the parameters, of getting things moving in the right direction, really in all directions. And you know, I think what he's accomplished so far is really very impressive. But now we need to have implementation and execution of policy on the ground. This is not a small matter, and security is an issue in Damascus. We know there's still bad actors, moving around inside the city, and so I know that's always a concern for the State Department. But we have to, just as the EU has, just how Turkey has, just as other missions have, we need to find a solution to that security problem so that we can be playing a role. And I think that would send a very strong signal of commitment and confidence to the government, and it would make all these other steps that Mary and Joe and Charles have laid out, I think, easier and more immediate. The other thing is that I think Tom Barak, as Mary said, has done a wonderful job of integrating U.S. business interests into our policy. He's brought a lot of U.S. business leaders into the country and introduced them to senior leaders. And there's a lot of very productive conversations that haven't maybe reached the surface, but are that just under the surface right now, that are really promising. And of course, I think we want to see the U.S. private sector lead in Syria. Mary highlighted the opportunity in tech. And in our report, we specifically highlight this opportunity for U.S. tech firms, because you've got a very strong partner in Abdul Salam Hakel, the Minister of Technology and Communications in Damascus. And with so much else going on in the Gulf in tech, we see Syria as being an important complement and corollary to that. And if Trump, if the Trump administration's Middle East policy is tech policy, and if Trump administration's tech policy is Middle East policy, including Syria in this approach, I think could be very advantageous for U.S. firms, especially those who are engaged in the infrastructure elements that Mary described. Third, also, as Joe has said, we see a real need to clarify the U.S. relationship to the SDF. We need to clarify it to the SDF, and we need to clarify it to the government of Syria. You know, I was U.S. ambassador in Baghdad in 2014 to 16. That was the time when the United States entered its relationship with the SDF. That was a very powerful and important relationship. That was a key element in the defeat of ISIS. And the SDF was an outstanding partner in defeating ISIS. And that, I can't say that strongly enough. But at that time, ISIS was the wolf at the sled. And, we needed to defeat ISIS, and we found the right partner to do it. Now we're facing a new set of problems and challenges. It doesn't mean we need to abandon the SDF, but we need to be very clear that the SDF needs to be incorporated into Syrian institutions, and that Syria needs to establish sovereignty over its entire territory. And that needs to be clear U.S. policy. When in our meetings, we sensed from Syrian leaders some uncertainty about the U.S. commitment on this point, and whether the United States would be sincere about using its leverage with the SDF to ensure that integration. Finally, also, as Mary said, we went out to Daria, the suburb of Damascus that had been terribly decimated. The destruction in those suburbs and really throughout Syria is enormous. And according to international sources, the unexploded ordnance problem in Syria is maybe the most extreme of any place in the world. There's a huge amount of reconstruction. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. But as we all know from our experience in other places, the first step in reconstruction is disposing of the unexploded ordnance. This is an area where the United States has led. This is not state building. The United States doesn't even have to lead with funding, but we need to lead on this issue as a convener. We bring the technical experience, we bring the understanding. We've done this in other places. You know, when we, and Joe will remember when we had to do a lot of rebuilding in Ramadi after ISIS had destroyed Ramadi and then had been pushed out of Ramadi. We established a funding facility for immediate stabilization, FFIS. This was a UN initiative under the leadership of the formidable Lise Grande, who led our humanitarian recovery in Iraq. And the first step in this immediate stabilization was getting these demining teams into houses and into these communities to remove the mine. And that gave people the confidence to come back and start to rebuild. So we really feel that that this unexploded ordnance issue really needs to be elevated in the policy conversation, because we're not going to see the economic reconstruction. Farmers can't return to their fields. People can't return to their homes until we start to address this issue. Thank you again.
General, if you don't mind, I'd like to add a comment on the unexploded ordnance issue, and that is a member of our delegation, a member of the private sector, one of our colleagues, listened to one of the ministers talk about this, and he said, I have a company based in Boston, and our satellites can identify precisely the location of certain types of unexploded ordnance. And I right now am going to offer to do that pro bono to the extent that my company has that capability. And if the ordinance emits signals that my company does not pick up, I have colleagues in another company whom I'm going to contact, and I'm going to make them get to work as well. So these delegations do things that you don't often expect. Thank you.
Thanks for having that, Mary.
Thanks for grabbing that, Mary. That I recall that moment. It was pretty good moment for us there with being so responsive to them on this. So that kind of concludes kind of the overview of the trip here. And what we want to do is for the last 13 or 14 minutes, maybe move into some questions here. And we've got a number of them in the box. We won't get to all of them. We'll try to group a couple of them together. We'll get to as many as we can in the time we have. And I'll just kind of moderate them and then throw it out to the panel here. And I want to start with one from one of our listeners who is asking, how worried are we about Turkey gaining or having too much influence over Syria? Is that a threat to Israel? Let me just throw that out to maybe start with Ambassador Charles on that one here to see if there's any response.
Well, I think what we're seeing from the Syrian government, and we say this in the report, is intense balancing. I think the Syrian government is seeking to reassure the United States, Turkey, Israel, the regional players, that it wants to have healthy relationships with all. And I think as long as that balancing continues, that should be very reassuring to Israel and to the other neighbors. I think it would be a problem if any one country starts to have a dominant role inside of Syria. That would be a threat to Syrian sovereignty. That would be a breach of the promise that President Sharaa has given the people of Syria. And it's certainly not in U.S. interest to see any one country, including the U.S., have a very dominant role. I think having this sort of committee approach to Syria, I think has the potential to be very, very successful if we can reach consensus.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anybody else there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add, it's not a coincidence that Ahmed al-Shara's first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia and not to Turkey. That as Ambassador Jones was just making very clear, that Ahmed al-Shara and his government knew right from day one that they had to clearly demonstrate that they were not anybody's particular, puppet or plaything in the middle of the Middle East. And so the balancing was a fact from day one. There's also, to speak a little bit even more sort of plainly about it, the reality that what Damascus needs most right now, first of all, what it needed was international credibility and legitimacy. And I think basically it's pretty much gained that in the first 12 months. But what it really, really needs is investment. And the blunt reality is that compared to a lot of other regional states, Turkey's economy is not in a place to start flushing, hundreds of millions of dollars into the Syrian economy. It has offered, construction firms and workers and equipment and everything else. But the Gulf is really the region with the great advantage today when it comes to those more in-depth relationships in Damascus. And as someone who tracks like every single diplomatic meeting on Damascus 7 days a week, it is the Gulf states at the government and the private sector level that dominate engagement with the transitional government. It's not Turkey. And as the questioner was relating the question to Israel, we are also in a blunt reality where in November this past month, I think I already said this, over 100 Israeli ground incursions into Syria and a very, very deadly raid just south of Damascus that left 14 people dead, half of them women and children. Incidents like that, trajectories like that will only push Damascus into the lap of governments who are willing to provide the kind of military, equipment and guarantees to deter the likes of Israel. So we are also in a dynamic here where Israeli action is actually, we're not there yet, but encouraging Damascus to fall more deeply in the lap of countries like Turkey, who are more willing to push back against what they see as Israeli aggression. So both sides, all sides, have an interest in falling back to a more balanced approach. And frankly, listening and paying a lot more attention to the words of Damascus, which continue to be on the need for calm, on the need for no problems with anybody, and for the need for, dialogue and understanding. We need to embrace that pragmatism rather than dealing with it with suspicion and hostility.
Very briefly on that, can you just you or Ambassador, maybe Mary, jump on it? But what we saw with respect to China and Russia, and first of all, the potential for their investment in the country. I'm not sure that jumped out at me as a big issue. Certainly, China may be in a position to do that. Russia may have some other focus there. But about those two countries, can you just talk a little bit about that, Charles?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, well, first thing on Russia, having spent many, many years being, the source of gigantic, huge bombing, indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations, the destruction of hundreds of hospitals all across the country. Vladimir Putin did an abrupt 180-degree shift as he gave a private jet with Bashar al-Assad on it access to Russian airspace on December the 8th last year. As I understand, he called up the Syrian embassy in Moscow, an unusual diplomatic move, and told them to take down the old Syrian flag and hoist up the new green flag of the Syrian revolution, with Russian state media outside the building to film that flag change. And from there on in, the Russian government has dealt with this new transition with extraordinary pragmatism. Russia to this day is the only government anywhere in the world that has sent a whole of government delegation to Damascus. The funny story being that, the foreign ministry didn't have a table long enough to fit every single deputy minister from every single ministry in Russia around a single table as they arrived on a very large plane quite unexpectedly. So Russia has gained a great deal of good faith from Damascus. It has offered them a comprehensive arms deal, of course, with the background being that Syria's military has always relied on Russian and Soviet origin weaponry. It hasn't been accepted yet, but they are there. Speaking of the difficulties with Israel, the most recent Russian Ministry of Defense delegation to Syria a few weeks ago, they sent a 15-vehicle convoy escorted by Syrian Ministry of Interior vehicles down to the Golan Heights to visit all of the areas where Russian military police used to be stationed as a barrier between Syrian and Israeli forces. That actually triggered quite a vitriolic response on the Israeli side, who said that they didn't want to go back to previous arrangements. So Russia is clearly angling for a renewed status in Syria. The Chinese on the diplomatic level are far more cautious. But there has been a lot of Chinese private sector delegations coming in and out of Damascus over the last 9 to 12 months. I think there's a lot of concern that so President Trump has offered this reduction of tariffs to Syria from 41% to 10%, which for the domestic economy in Syria, provided things open up, is very good news. But it's also very good news for the likes of China, who can suddenly put together a factory manufacturing anything in very short order, and then benefit from exporting from Syria with 10% tariffs instead of the tariff levels that come and are imposed on China. And so China's ability to much more rapidly and flexibly move and adapt in circumstances like this could easily become quite a significant player in that kind of small and medium sized enterprises. We're not there yet, but they have certainly expressed quite a bit of interest in that sector as well as in the railway sector, of course, which won't come as a surprise to many.
Yeah, I would just add, which I think underlines the importance of having U.S. tech firms and U.S. tech interests enter Syria as soon as possible to establish sort of the predominance of the U.S. tech stack, so that China doesn't establish the predominance of the Chinese tech stack. Look, there's going to be Chinese factories in Syria, and that's probably a good thing. We want to see Syrians go to work. We want to see Syrians produce. We want to see them export. And railroads, fine. We know that the Jordanians are already interested in building the northern connector to their national railroad. So all those things, if the Chinese are going to are inevitably going to be involved in some way or another commercially. As Charles says, we're not seeing the same outreach politically, but we want to make sure that the U.S. secures its tech advantages that it's already established in the Gulf to make sure those extend to Syria. Sorry, Mary, did you want to add anything to that?
Maybe just one quick follow-up as we're talking about investment in business and like that. I wonder if maybe Ambassador Charles can talk a little bit about the status of the real business community in Syria right now and its ability to help attract interest there. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like right now? I mean, we saw a smattering of that certainly in Damascus. I mean, in places that look like any big city that we've been in, lots of restaurants, lots of things like that. But can you talk a little bit more about just the business community in Damascus or in Syria?
Well, again, I would say, as Charles referenced earlier, what we're seeing now in Syria is a lot of business people who left, and now they've come back. And there has been this interim lifting of sanctions. So, and Mary's exactly right. No major U.S. firm, no major international firm is going to go into Syria if there's the risk of snapback or if the sanctions are going to be renewed in 6 months. But some of these Syrian businessmen have just taken a flyer and have gone in there and started to do stuff. But as you know, and we heard this in many of our meetings, that you can't even transact in dollars in Syria. That's a violation. It's still a violation of the Caesar Act until it gets lifted. So everything has really been shut down. And I think lifting the sanctions will make an extraordinary difference. One of the other things that we talk about with the lifting these sanctions is that, of course, Syria is going to benefit, but Jordan's going to benefit. Lebanon's going to benefit. We've already seen a 400% increase in Jordan's trade with Europe because it's now running trucks back and forth through Syria. This recreates the old truck routes that existed back before the civil war started. And those truckers, of course, couldn't traverse Syria during the periods of violence and instability. So this is going to lift all boats. And I think, again, when we talk to Syrian officials and when we've talked to the U.S.-Syria Business Council, they are eager to get in and start making these investments. Sorry to guess, but when Minister of Economy Shara visited us here at MEI, this is not in Damascus, he had a 7-point plan that involved rejuvenating industry, also extending, getting people banked. That'll be a very important part of this recovery, is just getting people basic banking services, which they don't have right now.
Thank you, Ambassador. Hey, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to ask one question. I'm actually going to combine a couple things together and just throw it off the panel here. One of our listeners is asking if we could please address what Syrian officials believe is happening in the Golan, and what do they believe the U.S. role should be in this particular part of the country. And then secondly, can we talk about, obviously this has been a setback for the Iranian regime. What do we think the current sentiments are of the government and the people towards Iran? Charles, let's go to you first.
Sure, big question. I mean, well, first thing on Iran, Yeah, I mean, an interesting distinction to be drawn between, you know, the Assad regime's previous two big backers, Russia, which I've spelled out already, and Iran. And the Syrian people, I think, feel more kind of historical, cultural affinity with Russia, and far less so to Iran, which explains the significant divergence in terms of relationship. So to this day, there really has been no direct diplomatic contact with Iran. I don't think there's a great deal of popular support to see that being, you know, launched or pushed either way. Behind the scenes, there is, I think, no question that I think at least elements within the Quds Force have been involved alongside Hezbollah in trying to support the anti-government insurgency, and of course to continue to smuggle weapons into Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syrian territory. And so more than anything from Damascus's perspective, Iran still looks like a security challenge rather than a diplomatic opening or opportunity. And I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon. What was the first question? Sorry,
I want to know what's happening in the Golan.
And the Golan. I mean, well, I mean, since December the 8th, about 300 square kilometers of territory has been occupied newly by Israel. So that was the original 1974 demilitarized zone, plus an additional 300 square kilometers of territory. Within that, the IDF have established 9 military bases. And in so doing, depopulated several villages and wiped out about half of a very significant historical forest. And so on a local level, it's crippled the agricultural sector, which basically dominates that whole Golan southwestern region. And then on a security level, like I say, we've had last month 101 ground incursions deeper into government-held areas of Syria. Those ground incursions typically involve IDF forces establishing pop-up checkpoints where they stop and question all passing citizens. They often take fingerprints and photographs and biometric information. They search the cell phones. And this is creating great frustration and if not anger and hostility within the local communities. So clearly from Israel's perspective, this is all seeking to create an expanded buffer zone to secure themselves from potential future threats. My fear as a Syria analyst is that there is no threat, but this behavior is creating a threat down the line. And so, you know, the urgent thing here is to encourage de-escalation on the Israeli side. I should add, there have been 0 Syrian government responses to any of those military actions. Over 1,000 airstrikes, nearly 700 ground incursions, 0 response from the Syrian side. But that pragmatism and that patience can only last so long.
Thank you, Charles. And I would just close with a little chapeau there is that one of the kind of the talking points we did here is that Syria views itself not as a threat to anybody else in the region. That was a very clear point that I think was, you know, that resonated through many of our meetings. I want to first of all thank our panelists or thank my fellow travelers for joining me today and for sharing your expertise and your observations. We really appreciate it. And to all of our guests today who joined us, thank you very much for joining us. Please check out the MEI website and look for more great stuff from Charles and all the other experts at MEI who are publishing fantastic stuff on this really critical region every day. Thanks, everybody, and have a happy holiday.
Thank you, General.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.